Have you ever been that person who sat down at your desk planning to work for maybe 20 minutes? But when you finally looked up at the clock, almost 2 hours had passed? Not 2 hours of scrolling online. Not 2 hours of working while chatting with friends. But 2 hours where you almost forgot everything around you. You forgot your phone. You forgot you were even sitting. You almost forgot about time itself. I remember a moment like that. That day, I only planned to jot down a few notes for a video idea. Just a few lines. I opened my laptop, placed a cup of coffee beside me, and started typing. At first, I was still a little distracted. I opened another tab, then closed it. My phone buzzed once, and I glanced at it. But about 10 minutes later, a very strange feeling began to appear. It felt like my mind suddenly clicked into place. One idea connected to the next. One sentence naturally pulled the next one along. Not the kind of thinking where you force ideas to come. It felt more like everything was simply flowing out. My fingers started typing faster. I didn't need to stop and edit much. And the strangest part was, everything around me seemed to fade away. Not literally disappear. But it was as if my brain had temporarily turned off channels it didn't need. I no longer noticed the traffic noise outside. I stopped thinking about the messages I hadn't replied to. I forgot that I had planned to stand up and grab some water. There was only one thing left. The task in front of me. Then eventually I stopped. My neck felt a little stiff. My back was slightly sore. I looked at the clock. Almost 2 hours. The feeling at that moment was strange. Part of me felt incredibly satisfied. Another part felt a little confused. Something like, I just worked really efficiently. But there was also a quiet question in my head. What exactly just happened inside my brain? Why are there times when you can barely focus for 10 minutes before wanting to get up? But other times, you can work for hours without even feeling tired? Later, I discovered that this state actually has a name. People call it flow. Or more simply, a mental state where focus, skill, and challenge align almost perfectly. Many people talk about flow as if it were a superpower. Some people try to optimize it. Others try to hack it. But the thing that made me curious was something else. Not, how do you get into flow? But, what is the brain actually doing during that moment? Is it simply focusing a little harder? Or are there deeper biological changes happening inside our heads that we normally never notice? And more importantly, if we truly understand that mechanism, could we work better without paying the price of exhaustion afterward? Or could flow actually have a hidden downside that people rarely talk about? That was the question I started looking into. Not as a scientist, just as an ordinary person who had experienced that state several times and wondered, what on earth did my brain just do? After reading quite a lot of research in neuroscience and psychology, I began to notice something interesting. The flow state isn't just about concentrating harder. It's more like the brain switching into a different operating mode. If you imagine the brain as a large city, many different districts are active at the same time. Some areas handle logical thinking. Others process emotions. Some constantly monitor the outside environment. And there is one particular area that tends to interrupt us quite often. That area is the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is responsible for things like self-evaluation, thinking about the future, worrying whether you're doing something right or wrong, wondering what other people think about you. In simple terms, this is the voice inside your head. The voice that sometimes jumps in while you're working and says, is this good enough? Maybe I'm doing this wrong. Should I rewrite that part? But in a flow state, something unusual happens. Some research suggests that activity in this region temporarily decreases. Scientists call this phenomenon transient hypofrontality, which roughly means a temporary reduction of activity in the frontal areas of the brain. That sounds very technical, but in everyday language, it's something like this. Normally, there's a very strict manager standing behind you in your mind, constantly checking everything. In a flow state, that manager temporarily goes on vacation. No one is constantly criticizing your work anymore. No one interrupts every 5 minutes to ask, "Is this really correct?" And when that constant self-monitoring quiets down, the brain starts doing something else. It speeds up information processing. At the same time, several neurochemicals in the brain also begin to change. During flow, the brain often increases the production of certain neurotransmitters. For example, dopamine. This chemical is associated with motivation, attention, the feeling of reward. Dopamine helps the brain recognize what is worth focusing on. It acts almost like a spotlight pointing at the task in front of you. There is also norepinephrine, which increases alertness and sharpens reaction speed. And in some situations, the brain also releases endorphins and anandamida, chemicals associated with positive feelings and creativity. If you put all of this together, you can imagine it like this. Normally, your brain is like a car driving through a crowded city. Lots of red lights, lots of noise, lots of distractions. But when flow happens, it's as if the brain suddenly moves onto a wide open highway. Less noise, less internal interference, energy focused in one direction. The result is faster reactions, smoother thinking, decisions that are less frequently interrupted. And that's why so many people describe flow using very similar phrases. Ideas just start flowing. Time passes incredibly fast. Everything suddenly feels clear. But there is one important detail that I only understood later. Flow does not happen simply because the brain decides to focus harder. It usually appears when two things meet at the right moment. Keycap 1, the challenge is difficult enough. Keycap 2, your skill level is just high enough to handle it. If the task is too easy, right pointing arrow, the brain becomes bored. If the task is too difficult, right pointing arrow, the brain becomes stressed. Flow usually lives right in the middle. It's like playing a game, where the level is challenging enough that you must try your best, but not so hard that you want to quit. When those two things match each other, the brain often shifts into that special mode. But that is only the technical side of the story. What's even more interesting is the human experience inside that state. Why do we feel so good when we are in flow? And why do we sometimes feel completely exhausted afterward? And why do some people start to chase the feeling of flow without even realizing it? That part of the story might be even more important. After understanding roughly what happens in the brain during flow, I began noticing something interesting. The flow state isn't only about productivity. It also creates a very unusual experience of emotion and time. If you've ever been in flow before, you may recognize a few familiar signs. The first one is time distortion. You sit down to work at 8 o'clock. When you look up again, it's already 10:30. But internally, it feels like only 20 minutes passed. This doesn't happen simply because you forgot to check the clock. It's related to the fact that the brain regions involved in tracking time temporarily reduce their activity. Remember earlier when we talked about the prefrontal cortex acting like a manager? Part of that region constantly asks questions like, how long has it been? Should I stop now? When flow occurs, that internal timekeeper becomes quieter. It's similar to watching a movie that completely absorbs you. You stop checking the time. Except in flow, the movie is the task you are doing. The second feature is the satisfying feeling of making small progress. Every time you solve a small problem, the brain releases dopamine. It works almost like a scoring system in a game. You do something right pointing arrow plus 1 point. Finish a piece of code right pointing arrow plus 1. Write a clear idea right pointing arrow plus 1. Your brain starts recognizing this activity is worth continuing. And dopamine helps you focus even more. This creates an interesting feedback loop. Small progress right pointing arrow, dopamine right pointing arrow, deeper focus right pointing arrow, more progress. That's why many people describe flow as everything in my brain is running smoothly. But this is where the second side of the story begins. Flow is a bit like driving on a highway. Everything moves fast. Everything feels smooth. But if you drive too long, you might not realize how tired you've become. When you're in flow, the brain often temporarily ignores certain signals from the body. For example, thirst, neck strain, the need to stand up, eye fatigue. Normally these signals would encourage you to stop. But in flow, the brain says, wait, this task is more important right now. And that's why many people have a familiar experience. While working right pointing arrow, everything feels exciting. But once you stop right pointing arrow, suddenly you feel exhausted. Almost like finishing a long marathon. There is another detail that people rarely talk about. Flow can create a mild form of addiction. Not addiction in an immediately harmful sense, but because flow involves dopamine and endorphins. The brain remembers. That feeling was really good. So we begin trying to return to that state again. That's why video games are very good at creating flow. Social media creates chains of small rewards. Some people work for hours without stopping. The brain loves the feeling of making progress. But the problem is, flow does not automatically mean it is healthy. If we're not careful, it can lead to working for too long, forgetting to rest, ignoring signals from the body, and then the very mechanism that helped you work effectively can slowly drain your energy over time. That's when I realized a very common misunderstanding. Many people think the goal is enter flow as often as possible. But maybe that isn't the right goal at all. If we misunderstand this, we might accidentally turn a very useful brain mechanism into an energy trap. After reading quite a lot about flow, I realized something slightly amusing. A lot of content online talks about flow in a very specific way. How to stay in flow all day. Hack your brain to achieve constant flow. Turn flow into a productivity superpower. It sounds appealing. But the more I read scientific research, the more I noticed a small problem. Flow is not a state the brain was designed to stay in forever. It's more like a temporary acceleration mode. Think of driving a car. Your car might run very smoothly at 120 kilometers per hour. But that doesn't mean you should drive at 120 kilometers per hour all day long. The brain works in a similar way. Flow can help you focus deeply, process information faster, become more creative. But it also consumes a significant amount of neural energy. The human brain already uses about 20% of the body's total energy. Even though it only represents about 2% of body weight. When you enter flow, the brain often allocates even more resources to one single task. In simple terms, you are burning fuel very efficiently, but also quite quickly. If we only pay attention to the great feeling of flow, we can easily make a common mistake. That mistake is turning flow into the goal itself, when in reality, flow is just a side effect that appears when the right conditions are present. It's similar to running. Some days your rhythm feels perfect. Everything flows smoothly. But if you force yourself and think, Today I must feel exactly like that. Then usually, it doesn't happen. Flow works the same way. The more you force a right-pointing arrow, the harder it becomes. The more obsessed you become right-pointing arrow, the less natural it feels. There is another point that I find worth thinking about. Flow does not automatically mean you are doing something meaningful. The brain only cares about one thing. Is this activity challenging and rewarding? That's why flow can appear when you are playing games, scrolling social media, gambling, working, painting, writing code. The brain does not evaluate long-term value or morality. It simply responds to reward structures and challenge levels. And that is why some industries design their products extremely well to create flow. Video games, social media platforms, entertainment apps. Not necessarily because they want you to become healthier, but because flow keeps you engaged longer. So once I understood this, I began to see flow differently. Instead of asking, how can I enter flow more often? A better question might be, what do I want to use flow for? Flow should be a tool, not a goal. A mental state that helps you learn more deeply, be more creative, solve difficult problems. But it should still exist inside a larger system that includes rest, recovery, long-term health. Otherwise, a very common paradox appears. You work extremely efficiently for a few hours, but afterward, your brain feels completely drained. And if that pattern repeats too many times, your overall productivity actually decreases. Not because you are lazy, but because the brain's energy system was never designed to run at maximum speed all the time. So the next question becomes very practical. If flow is a tool, how should we use it so it benefits both the brain and the body, instead of quietly exhausting us? After understanding what flow really is, I started changing a few small habits. Not to hack my brain, just to create conditions where flow can appear naturally, and more importantly, to make sure it doesn't leave me exhausted. I realized we can think about this in 4 different moments. Before starting work, during the work itself, right after stopping, and the next day. Each stage has a few simple principles. Before starting, reduce noise for the brain. Flow is very difficult when the brain has to process too many signals at once. Phone notifications, messages, emails, browser tabs. All of these are like multiple people talking at the same time in a crowded room. Your brain constantly has to switch attention. One of the simplest ways to increase the chance of entering flow is to reduce that noise before starting. For example, turn off notifications. Close unnecessary tabs. Place your phone out of reach. Not because those things are bad, but because the brain focuses better when the environment contains fewer interruptions. It's like reading a book in a quiet room. Limitations. This isn't always possible, especially if your job requires constant responses. But if you can create even a 30 to 60 minute window of low noise, the chances of entering flow often increase. During work, choose challenges that are just difficult enough. Flow rarely appears when a task is too easy or too difficult. If it's too easy, right-pointing arrow, boredom. If it's too difficult, right-pointing arrow, stress. One small strategy I learned is to break tasks into smaller steps that are just challenging enough. Instead of saying, finish the entire article, start with, write the introduction. Then, write 3 key points. Each small completion creates a tiny signal of progress. Remember dopamine? Every small improvement is like adding a point in the brain's reward system. That helps sustain focus. Limitations. Not every task can be easily broken down. But whenever possible, smaller steps help the brain find its rhythm more easily. After stopping, don't forget to slow down. One mistake I used to make quite often was leaving flow too abruptly. Working deeply, then suddenly jumping to another task. When that happens, the brain sometimes feels strangely empty. The reason is that dopamine and norepinephrine levels were relatively high. A simple solution is to allow the brain a few minutes to slow down. For example, stand up and walk for 5 minutes. Drink water. Look into the distance. These things sound small, but they help the nervous system transition more smoothly. Limitations. This ritual isn't always necessary. But if you've been working very deeply, a short pause helps your body recover faster. The next day, recovery is part of productivity. This is something I understood quite late. Flow often consumes a significant amount of cognitive energy. If you work deeply for 3 or 4 hours today, your brain may need good sleep and proper rest to recover. Research on memory shows that during sleep, the brain consolidates new information, clears metabolic waste products from neural activity. In simple terms, sleep is when the brain cleans up after the party. If you don't sleep well, the ability to enter flow the next day often drops noticeably. Limitations. Life schedules are not always perfect. But if you want sustainable deep work, sleep may be the most underestimated factor of all. When I put all of this together, I began seeing flow very differently. It's not a magical mental state. It's simply a natural operating mode of the brain that appears when environment, challenge, and physical energy line up at the right moment. And the most important thing is not, how can I enter flow as often as possible? But rather, knowing when to enter and when to stop. After learning more about flow, one idea completely changed how I think about productivity. I used to believe working efficiently meant focusing for as long as possible, doing as much as possible, staying in a motivated state as long as possible. But the more I understand how the brain works, the more I realize something simple. The brain is not a machine. It is closer to an ecosystem. Sometimes it accelerates. Sometimes it rests. Sometimes it creates. Sometimes it simply needs silence. Flow is one of those rare moments when many things align at the same time. Your skill level is strong enough. The challenge is interesting enough. The environment is quiet enough. Your physical energy is stable enough. When these conditions align, the brain begins operating very smoothly. But the key point is this: flow cannot be forced. It's more like the wind. You cannot command the wind to blow. But you can raise your sails in the right direction. Reduce environmental noise. Choose challenges that are meaningful. Maintain stable physical energy. And sometimes, just allow the brain to do what it was designed to do. Another thought I find interesting. Flow often makes us feel very good. But what creates a sustainable life is not how often that feeling appears. It's whether, after those hours of deep focus, you still have energy left for the next day. The brain does not thrive in extremes. It doesn't like constant stress. But it also doesn't enjoy endless boredom. Somewhere between those two extremes, there is a very interesting zone. A place where you learn something new, solve meaningful problems, feel yourself improving. Flow tends to appear in that space. Not because we successfully hacked the brain, but because we gave it the kind of challenge it naturally enjoys. And perhaps that is the most valuable lesson in understanding this mechanism. Knowledge about the brain is not meant to turn you into someone who works 16 hours a day. Quite the opposite. It helps us realize that mental health and long-term productivity are part of the same system. When you sleep well, when you rest at the right moments, when you prevent your mind from drowning in constant noise, the brain begins doing what it was built to do. Think, learn, connect ideas, and sometimes fall into that beautiful state of flow without forcing it, just because the conditions are right. Maybe that is also a very practical way to live. You don't need to chase every new productivity trick. You simply need to understand how your own body works. Adjust your environment a little. And sometimes, that alone is enough to make everything flow more naturally. The content in this video is shared from commonly discussed perspectives in scientific research on the brain and psychology, with the goal of helping viewers better understand how the brain and body function in everyday life. This information is not a substitute for professional medical advice. If you have concerns related to neurological health, mental health, sleep, or medications,